very big question. It's provoked by our situation in the United States and in the world, where we see strong men rising to power, encouraging mob politics. And the question, of course, is democratic capitalism possible? So it seems like a question for now, but it's also a very ancient question. And I thought I would begin the forum by reading a little bit about the debates at Putney that have preoccupied historians, debates that took place in the middle of the 17th century. Some of you will be familiar with this, but the debates occurred in Cromwell's New Model Army in 1647. There was no democracy, there was no capitalism, but democracy was nevertheless a vision that animated people, and animated people for the reason that democracy seemed like a way to harness the state, to harness government, to counter concentrated wealth and power in civil society. So here was the argument. It was an argument for universal male suffrage, and the argument was stated by a colonel in the New Model Army, a radical leveler leader. That's what the grassroots was called at the time, levelers. So Colonel Rainbow says, "For really I think that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live, as the greatest he. And therefore truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first, by his own consent, to put himself under that government." In other words, the right to vote. But the General Ireton, who was Cromwell's son-in-law, replied just as clearly that mass political rights would endanger property rights. Here's what he said: "No person hath a right to an interest or share in the disposing of the affairs of the kingdom that hath not a permanent fixed interest in this kingdom. All the main things that I speak for is because I have an eye to property. If you admit any man that hath a breath in being, a majority of the commons might be elected who had no local and permanent interest. Show me what you will stop at, wherein you will fence any men in a property by this rule. If we let them vote, they'll attack concentrated wealth and property." That is the issue. And that is the issue today. It was the issue hundreds of years ago. Still, people have been so moved by the possibility of democracy, by the possibility that we could somehow contrive a set of institutions in which equality, equal and widespread votes, would control a state that had majesty and a state that had coercive power. So moved by this idea that I think democracy, the aspiration for democracy, has become the most powerful idea in the modern world. So the hope is for equality and inclusiveness, and it is the hope that inspired the radical Democrats of the American Revolution. It's the hope that inspired the abolitionist movement. It's the hope that inspired the labor movement. But on the other side, there have always been the groups who fenced in property against the democratic hordes. ruling groups resist democracy with historical consistency, persistence, and that tells us something. From the levelers to the Chartists in England, to the radical Democrats of the American Revolution, to the new birth, the abolitionists who pushed for the new birth of freedom after the Civil War, to the great Black freedom movement that fought for the right to vote for Black people. These movements were always resisted, and our government was arranged to resist democracy. The constraints on democracy are there at the beginning, in the creation of a Supreme Court that can overrule Democratic representatives, in the creation of a Federal Reserve that is not accountable to Democratic publics, in the resistance from the beginning, but especially now, to the right to vote. Can you imagine? Did you ever think that would become an issue in American politics? It is right now. So it's a big issue. It's the issue behind the kerfuffle over the Kavanaugh nomination. It's the issue in these midterms that are approaching. And it's the issue that drives so many activists these days. Did you ever think this would happen? To join the Democratic Party or to run for alderman. That is what's happening. And we have to discuss this. So we have a very great panel to help illuminate these questions, to talk about, is democratic capitalism possible? And these are people who have all been in the trenches, fighting the manifold expressions of this ancient conflict between concentrated property and democratic dreams. So to join us and to begin, I'm going to ask you to talk first. J.Phillip Thompson, who is on leave from MIT and is the author of Double Trouble, Black Mayors, Black Communities, and the Struggle for Deep Democracy. The Phil Thompson he got his PhD at the graduate school in my department, I'm proud to say. Hi, Arthur. Welcome. Phil has now returned to New York. He knows New York politics well. He worked with the Dinkins campaign. He served under the Dinkins administration. And he is now returning to New York as deputy mayor for strategic policy initiatives. After Phil, we're going to turn to Phillips Fein, who is on the history faculty at NYU and is the author of Invisible Hands. Here's another expression of what I'm talking about, of what Paula and her colleagues wanted us to talk about today. Tim is the author of a book, Invisible Hands, The Businessmen's Crusade Against the New Deal, and also a book called Fear City, the New York City Fiscal Crisis and the Rise of the Age of Austerity. And then we're going to hear from Maurice Weeks, who is co-executive director of ACRE and a member of the Advisory Council of Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity. So let's begin. I'm going to ask each one of you to take 15 minutes, and then we'll have a few exchanges between you. And we're going to begin with Phil.
Thanks. Fran didn't mention I was a student of hers, and she was on my dissertation committee.
I'm proud of that.
Me too. I'm excited about a lot of the new scholarship that has come out on American history that addresses the question we're talking about today. There's been a lot of new scholarship on Reconstruction, the Civil War, origins of popular identities, gender, class, racial identities. It's important scholarship. It wasn't until until Ignatiev's book came out, How the Irish Became White, that I learned that more than 60,000 peasants in Ireland signed a petition in the 1820s asking Irish immigrants who had moved to the United States to fight against slavery and to join slave rebellions. Didn't know that. I only learned a few years ago that more than 500,000 women in England signed a petition demanding England abolish slavery. And they did the petition while Marx was writing Capital in London. Somehow it didn't make it in the Capitol. I didn't know that before. And these things, I think, kind of point to how distorted our notions are of even what our history is. And how ideological has been our treatment of American history. I mean, we usually don't think about the Civil War as a war involving capital, but it was the greatest liberation of capital by far of any revolution in history. But we don't talk about it that way. It wasn't just about black people not liking white people. It was a liberation of capital. And the radical abolitionists, Phillips, Sumner, understood that. But we don't talk about it that way. We don't talk about the reversal of Reconstruction as a counter-revolution. But it was. It was a counter-revolution. So anyway, I wasn't planning to say that. But I think that capitalism is not just an economic system or an economic theory. It's how our politics and culture operates. It's an entire system. It's a way of life. And I think capitalism is being challenged by three things: demographics, climate change, and technology. And I'll make an argument for that. But first on demographics. There's a play out now. It's showing in Boston, and I think they want to come to New York, and it's called The Black Clown. It's actually a musical, and it's based on Langston Hughes's poem, The Black Clown, 1931. And some of you may remember that when sanitation workers went on strike in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968, many of the sanitation workers, black sanitation workers, held up signs saying, "I am a man." Mm-hmm. And I don't know how many of you know that that actually came out of Langston Hughes's very popular poem. And the poem begins, "You laugh because I'm poor and black and funny, not the same as you. Because my mind is dull and dice instead of books will do for me to play with when the day is through. I am the fool of the whole world. Laugh and push me down. Only in song and laughter I rise again, a black clown." Poem goes on, but at the end, it talks about all of black history, but at the end it says, "Cry to the world that all might understand. I was once a black clown, but now I'm a man." That's where the poem comes from. And the poem was addressed actually to the white labor movement and to the white left in the early 1930s. And Langston Hughes, working in Harlem, there was another person, W.B. Du Bois, working in Harlem, and he published a book the next year called Black Reconstruction, also addressed to white labor and to the white left. And Black Reconstruction made the argument that white workers have identified themselves as a superior group, unlike black workers, separate, and that is how capitalism operates. And that labor was about to make the same mistake again if they didn't integrate the labor movement and if they caved in to the Southern Dixiecrats' demands that agricultural labor and domestic labor be excluded from the Labor Relations Act. And labor caved in. They did what Du Bois begged them not to do. I think this is fundamental to understanding how capitalism works, and as Fran said, from the very beginning. The US is only a couple of decades away from becoming a majority non-white nation. This is a challenge to capitalism because from its very beginning, a system of inequality had to have a way of winning the majority of working people to its side. The system we created, the kind of democracy we created, depended on racial hierarchy. It wasn't just how the Supreme Court is structured. It was slavery. Slavery. It was racial segregation. It was colonialism. So that most workers, and here we're talking about white workers, would not see themselves as fundamentally aligned with workers of color. And that is what Langston Hughes was talking about when he says, you see me as a clown. You don't see me as you. Now, this is not an original argument. Du Bois made this argument. Randolph made this argument. Thurgood Marshall made this argument in Brown versus Board of Ed. He said racial segregation was created to keep poor whites and blacks from coming together during the progressive movement. That's what the whole purpose of it is. It's not about education, it's about that. Thurgood Marshall said that, Martin Luther King said that. One of the things we have not done in American history very much is read black people. And that's another one of the great things about a lot of current scholarship. There's a lot coming out now of what black political thought and critique has been for the last 250 years. Now, if white workers ever identified with the black poor, the whole system would collapse. But until now, they never have. Not as majority. This is what has kept the system stable. The problem is that workers who think of themselves as above black people or above Latino people are becoming a minority. Workers of color are becoming more numerous, and young white people, especially in cities, are more and more breaking loose from white nationalism or white superiority. This is the undercurrent of what we were seeing with Andrew Gillum in Florida, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Ben Jealous in Maryland, Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts. It's the force that elected Obama twice. And within this, there's a vibrant black feminist upsurge that eventually might link arms with the white feminist upsurge, and that would be devastating to capitalism as we know it. It would be devastating because workers would start voting for candidates, policies, and laws that overturn inequality. So that's the first threat. Second threat, climate change. It's not only that the overuse of fossil fuels has disrupted the weather and threatens to destroy much of human civilization. What's worse is that we saw this coming and we didn't stop it. And we still haven't stopped it. This points to how stupid and irrational it is to have private interests, in this case energy companies, be the main planners for how society makes energy. If government hands over responsibility for sustainable energy to private groups, and we stay in our current path, there's going to be a big backlash. Last year it was Puerto Rico, the year before it was Houston, today, right now, it's North Carolina. These things are not going away, they're going to become more and more frequent. But we are not only being stupid and irrational about energy, the world is literally running out of fresh water. We're running out of concrete. We're running out of steel. China and India alone build a city the size of Houston every month. And we need 1.5 times the amount of concrete and steel that we have in the world to continue this. We have stuck to this myth that we don't need government and the market will solve every kind of problem. We're not investing nearly enough in green chemistry and material science to come up with sustainable alternatives to basic materials we need for human survival. We actually do need a government that's capable of planning for the common good. For example, the biggest threat to Manhattan with climate change is heat. It's extreme heat. We ought to be debating whether we should make Manhattan look like Venice to keep us cool. That might not only be a great job opportunity, it could make Manhattan a lot more beautiful. But this is the kind of thing government ought to be putting before the people, and we're not. We need a government to be on the cutting edge, putting issues before the public, not simply having politicians taking donations from big companies. Third challenge, technology. Technology has solved our most basic productivity problems. Fossil fuels technology, extracting fossil fuels, actually generates 10 trillion human work hours a day, if you were to equate it with human labor. It just far surpasses what human labor contributes in terms of productivity. Kansas alone last year produced enough wheat for 138 billion loaves of bread. Science and technology have really solved the basic problems of survival. And most workers today don't manufacture anything. They don't grow food either. Most workers in services and distribution, most wages in America have nothing to do with supply and demand curves. They are set by politics. What teachers make, what hospital workers make, what government workers make, even what farmers make, is all set by government policy, and that's determined through politics. It has nothing to do with the cost of widgets. Finance is over 40% of the economy today. In the 1970s, it was 7%. And they don't operate by the so-called laws of the market either. In 2008, we bailed out the finance sector with almost $10 trillion of taxpayer money. That surpasses no socialist country, no communist country has ever bailed out failing firms close to what we did in 2008 alone. So this whole thing about debate between socialism versus capitalism, it's actually a silly debate. We are beyond that. What we have right now is not about that. It's about power and control, not these old traditional debates about what is a more productive way of doing this or that. The real issues we need to confront have to do with distribution, and distribution is connected to ownership. Are you kidding? Okay. Right now, robots are beginning to be used in Walmart to stock shelves. This will lead to layoffs. If big box retail stores are owned by investors like Target, they will have no choice but to introduce robots and lay off workers too, otherwise they can't stay in business. Robots and artificial intelligence threaten to increase unemployment dramatically in the near future. Instead of making people's lives better, technology could make things worse. If Walmart was an employee-owned company, on the other hand, the workers could decide to introduce robots and cut their hours down to 30 hours a week, or allow themselves paid vacations, or raise their wages. This is how ownership connects to distribution, and this is why ownership matters. If we want to ensure a prosperous future for workers, we have to address these issues right now. Finally, Trump represents a feverish reaction to the things I just outlined. If the people are to use democracy to challenge inequality, or if they're about to, then some forces in America think the solution is to undermine democracy itself. If diversity and inclusion threatens racial hierarchy, then some forces in America think the solution is to build and weaponize a radical white nationalist movement. If the people are becoming wise to climate change, some people in America think the answer is to deny science or even the possibility of scientific truth. This is a serious moment, perhaps the most serious moment we've had in the world since World War II or the Civil War. I think the nation needs a strong labor movement, but if labor is to become strong, it has to reinvent itself fundamentally by addressing each of the three issues I outlined. The building trades have to reach out to the unemployed Black and Latino youth and then go over to the environmental groups and say, let's build a movement for full employment, and let's make America green and sustainable, and that will be our pathway. The hospital workers have to organize the millions of unorganized Medicaid recipients in New York City and beyond and say, let's make our communities healthier and wealthier at the same time by building a health system of wellness that keeps people out of emergency rooms. Steel workers and auto workers need to address who will own the new high-tech urban manufacturing space and not just say, we let company elites bake the pie and we just fight for a slice of whatever they decide to cook. That is a path to extinction for labor. If labor does this, we can defend and strengthen our democracy, and our democracy can shape the kind of economic future we want. Thank you.
Phillips, Fein.
Well, thank you to Paula and to the school for asking me to be here today, and to all the panelists. That was a wonderful talk. It's wonderful to be here, and to everybody for coming. So the question that we were charged with thinking about today, is democratic capitalism possible? As I was preparing, clearly this is a question that comes out of the current crises, both economic and political, that we face today. The crisis of inequality, the way that ramifies in politics, the sense that our political system is controlled by elite forces that the rest of the population has no ability to touch, the different crises that were referred to in the first talk. And I think kind of underneath that, a question, is democracy really possible today? And a sadness or a pessimism about that. As I was preparing, though, I was thinking it's a question that opens up to many other issues. I mean, is the question underneath it, is capitalism can democratic political institutions be sustained under capitalism? Is the question whether economic life itself can be organized in a democratic way? Is democracy the right to taking a break when you need one during your working day? Is it the right to take a day off if your child is ill? Is it really referring to a question about the distribution of rewards and growth? And what does possible mean anyway? Does it mean coexisting briefly for a moment in time? Does it mean kind of something indefinite? Does it mean a necessary condition? So the question opened up to all these other questions for me as I thought about it. And as a historian, I tend to think these are questions that can really only be answered not in the abstract, but historically. What have democracy and capitalism meant to each other, and how have they interacted in the past? And as I prepared, I was thinking one of the things that my historical work has led me to is just an awareness of how difficult it has been to win even the smallest types of social reforms, how conditional those are, how often they are threatened by private wealth, and this intensity of the struggle for even the smallest victories that the labor movement and the civil rights movement and other movements for social justice have waged in the past. So just to pull back briefly, I think often today when people are talking about democracy and capitalism. Actually, one last thing is, as I was preparing, I was also thinking this is a topic in a way that would have been difficult to discuss. It seems very much a product of a post-Cold War moment, or a long post-Cold War moment, but that it would have been hard to put this question forward for the labor movement, during the Cold War or 40 years ago. It is in some ways a question that comes about in a world in which there isn't a kind of the question of what a socialist alternative is opened up in a new way by the end of the Cold War. So that just came to me as well. So many historians have talked about these questions, I think, in a way that's shaped by the impressions people have of the kind of economy that grew out of the New Deal and thrived in post-war America, which is perceived as being a much more egalitarian social order, one with high union density, about a third of the working population in labor unions, one with very high top marginal income rates and corporate taxes. This has been echoed most recently in the work of economist Thomas Piketty. the idea that in the mid-20th century, economic inequality declined somewhat, slightly, not that much, but at least did not grow in the radical way that we have seen since the 1980s. This, of course, this order, there's a whole body of work which points out the many ways this was hedged in, the way that the post-war economy benefited white men much more than people of color and women. But I think that the idea of that as a more egalitarian economic order nonetheless hovers over our politics today. And the sense that that was a consensus that would exist for a long time afterward. And a lot of my work as a historian has been focused on looking at the ways in which this order was never really fully accepted by people at the top of the economy, even when it was most apparently robust and powerful. That for many of the economic leaders at the time, these things that might seem to actually accept capitalism in many ways, strong unions, high taxes, the post-war economy with its public sector very directed towards military needs, all of this looked to many business executives as though it was itself a harbinger of something like socialism. So as William Mullendore, one of the business leaders in the 30s who was very active in kind of campaigning against the New Deal, said, we cannot have both systems, that is, both the governmentally controlled and directed and the free enterprise system. We must have one or the other. And what he's talking about there is the very limited set of reforms that embody the New Deal. For some of the thinkers, the economic thinkers associated with this conservative mobilization, they were much more explicit about democratic politics being much less important than private ownership and seeing private ownership as the key to freedom. So Friedrich von Hayek, the Austrian economist who wrote The Road to Serfdom, criticized what he called the fashionable concentration on democracy, saying that planning or any kind of economic effort to think about and organize the economy always was a constraint on freedom, even if it was democratically chosen. And for others, institutions that might appear to us to be democratic in their nature, like unions, were actually the opposite. So Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises wrote that the collective bargaining was just bargaining at the point of a gun, and Hayek argued that the only purpose of unions was really to raise wages through coercion. So there's this kind of ambivalence and hostility to basic institutions of unions and the idea of using the state to shape economic life from a very early point. And this was not itself alone enough to end or topple the post-war order. That came during the 1970s for the changes in the material underpinnings, but at that point, there was a fierce and sharp reaction, and many of these ideas and political movements that had been growing over the post-war years kind of coalesce at this time and kind of animate, and I think continue in a lot of ways to motivate the reaction against the welfare state and against labor, let alone any broader and more democratic transformation. And I think I'll just end by saying in our own city, I think there's a similar story to be told. And in my book, Fierce City, which Fran alluded to, I talk about the post-war city as one which was, in many ways, although again, limited, deeply limited, but in many ways was more egalitarian than our contemporary city, which had a strong and ambitious and powerful public sector, an expansion of public housing, strong rent stabilization laws and protections for tenants, a manufacturing sector that was a vital part of the economy, generating jobs generally better paid than those in the service sector. There's a time that saw the expansion of public sector labor unions in the city, and the growth of the public hospital system, of a public health system, the expansion of CUNY and the library system, all of these public institutions contributing to an unusual political culture in the city, a culture that was democratic in ways that I think we don't think of always today, in ways that are markedly different from our New York. And this order came into question itself during the 1970s when the city encountered its fiscal crisis and when it was cut off from the credit markets by the banks that marketed its debt. And in response, the state created the Emergency Financial Control Board, a unelected body which became the model for subsequent efforts in many different cities to limit the ability of governments to determine their own direction. One legal writer has written positively about these control boards as dictatorships for democracy. So kind of the idea being that they come in when when people can't be counted on to govern themselves. This is the type of political arrangement that we see now in Puerto Rico, for example. And I think there's another, I think this story is one that it raises questions for our own city too. How could our city become more democratic? What are the challenges to that, and what are the possibilities? So in sum, I think that the history of the 20th century in New York in particular, and more generally in the United States, suggests the ways that in a capitalist economy there is a profound reluctance at the highest levels to accept other institutions, other movements, and norms that are not driven completely by the profit imperative. And even a brief look at this history reminds us how radical and how contentious even the smallest reforms have often been. I think I'll wrap up there.
Thank you. Maurice.
Great. First, I want to say how honored I am to be on this panel with these folks. Phil is someone who's been an intellectual role model of mine. Francis, I tricked my undergraduate university into giving me a degree by basically just reading everything you wrote. And Kim, I forced my entire staff to read Fear City, and they all had to purchase it. So I'm really honored to be on this panel, and yeah, so thanks for having me. So I'm Maurice. I'm the co-executive director of the Action Center on Race and the Economy. So my background is in community organizing. At ACRE, what we do is we support grassroots campaigns that are fighting around racial justice and economic justice issues, and particularly where those two things intersect, which is obviously very often. What that support looks like is through campaign strategy, and then through research as well. So the research dives right into work on the financial villains, or these titans of modern day capitalism, and how particularly they're pillaging communities of color. So I think I'm going to blow my punchline pretty early to the question of whether democratic capitalism is possible or not, with my answer of no, I don't really think so. So I have a couple of different reasons for this answer, some of which are perhaps more theoretically based, and a lot of the work that ACRE does actually out in the field is through popular and political education work. So working with local organizations, local groups of people, and really digging into questions like this and talking about structures of capitalism and drivers of racial injustice. In that, we get to talk about the roots of these two core pieces of the question, so democracy and capitalism. And I think in our work, you can see that they are, from their core, simply incompatible in so many ways. So the very structures of capitalism as we know it, whereby there's a small sort of class of folks who are accumulating more and more wealth and power, specifically using that power and accumulating that power to rewrite the rules so that they can accumulate even more and more wealth and power, is predicated by itself on lots of voices being ignored or silenced or destroyed or enslaved or worse. So in the best case, what you end up with is this poor facsimile of something that you call democracy that finds some way to discount democratic voice of certain people. So that can be by everyone has a right to vote, but the candidates are chosen by basically like 14 rich guys and they all stink. Or it's written into code that your voice means less than other people's voices. So I think I'm describing things that I think that we all probably can recognize in our current political climate, and I would argue probably the majority of American history, not to be super pessimistic. I got to make some controversial statements. I mean, I'm the undercard here. I'm punching above my weight. So the answer is I think no on sort of a structural or theoretical level for me. And I think there are ways to measure this that are a little bit more in my wheelhouse of sort of organizing. And one question to ask there is, do we see these things, actually, democracy and capitalism, being compatible in the field, like on the ground? That is, like, in places that we see capitalism or the titans of capitalism thriving, do we see that there is a possibility for true democracy or true democratic voice? Just saying the question out loud sounds slightly ridiculous to me, at least, because I think the answer is across a number of pieces of society that no, and it causes a breakdown when we try to make them compatible. So taking for a moment an issue that Aker focuses a tremendous amount on, of sort of municipal budgets and municipal finance. So increasingly, as financialization was referenced, financialization, or the growing power of finance over really the past 40 years to sort of usher in this new form of racial capitalism that hasn't been seen before. Finance is increasingly a player in sort of day-to-day municipal budgetary and municipal finance actions in ways that were probably unimaginable decades ago. So, the notion of a private entity or an investment bank owning an entire city's parking meters that they just got and have control of is totally something that is, we couldn't have imagined this before. So if you think of sort of how does democracy play into a question like that? So this is a bank owns all of the city. This bank, particularly that I'm thinking of, is Morgan Stanley, has all of Chicago's parking meters, charge exorbitant rates to who's tried to park in Chicago. It's really, really, really expensive. There's zero support for how much they're charging for the parking meters, and there's zero recourse for people to really do anything about it. There aren't democratic avenues for folks to be like, we all agree that this is ridiculous. We should claw back how much they're charging for it. It's entirely being handed off to a corporation, which is a boom for capitalism. It's great for Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley made $1 billion in cash and will make money over the next 40 years or something like that on the deal. But what does this mean for the everyday people? So that's one example. On top of this, I think that there are cases that Aker and our predecessor organization, Refund America, has worked on with partners, specifically in cases where in even more direct ways, democracy was ripped out of the hands of the people and handed over to these titans of racial capitalism that I'm referencing in investment firms, banks, hedge funds, other financial entities. I think in places like Detroit and Puerto Rico, you see the very intentional stripping of those rights to allow those folks to come in, make more changes, sell off all of the pieces of a city, and turn it into sort of a playground for themselves. So this is in the form of emergency management in cities in Michigan where I live, fiscal control boards like happened here and happened in Puerto Rico. These models, it should be noted, always seem to happen way more frequently in places that are communities of color, cities of color, places with high density of black and brown folks. So setting aside for a second the very real problem of these financial titans sort of dumping a tremendous amount of money into the democratic system, which is, I think, where folks often go when we think about sort of the compatibility between capitalism and democracy. How can democracy exist if so much money is being poured into the system? I think maybe more alarming for me, or at least as equally alarming, is this theory that tends to win the day, that any potential issue that comes up, any problem that comes up, which could have in the past or could, in sort of under the theory of democracy, be solved through a democratic process, is instead charged to a financial entity to solve the problem. So if you have problems with your parking meters and can't figure out what to do, give them to Morgan Stanley and they'll figure out what to do for you, instead of sort of figuring this out through any traditional democratic process. or you're having a little budget hiccup and something happened, or maybe a major budget hiccup, the perfect people to solve this are 14 hedge fund managers because they know what to do. So this, I think, creates the crisis of democracy, which is really existential. If we're really handing over sort of traditional democratic processes to the expertise, as we defined it, of the financial industry, then we will continue to see democracy being collapsing, essentially. I think it's also important to note that it may seem obvious that the victims of these problems that I'm citing here also match up with the voices that are least heard in our democracy. And I think that that's because the exploitation that's built into our current system of racialized capitalism is not only an exploitation of resources, although that is a critically important piece, but it's also an exploitation of democratic voice. So there are two things happening in order to make the system continue to move forward. There's money being funneled out from a particular set of folks, from black and brown folks, exploited from them through predatory lending, predatory forms of labor, et cetera. And then there's also democratic voice being ripped away, and the two are essential, actually, to happen at the same time in order to allow this current system that we see destroying so many lives and in many ways eating itself to operate. So the question then becomes, well, that was really depressing. So what do we do? What do we do about it? What's the solution if democratic capitalism isn't possible? Before I get into the solution, I feel the need to disclose that I have a tattoo that says "Eat the Rich" on my right arm. So you can but you can probably guess what I say that we should do. Make of that what you will. But the real answer, that is the real answer. But the real answer is the sort of organizing answer in this moment, I think, is really similar to sort of like the opposite of that final point that I made about exploitation. So if capitalism exploits both in terms of resources and democratic voice, and we can identify the titans of racialized capitalism, these entities that are really pushing it forward, and I target the financial industry in particular because it's so large and so powerful and is really the dominant industry in our economy and in our democracy as well. Then the task then becomes building enough power to really directly take on these entities so that those who are exploited can both at the same time gain financial stability, livelihood, and democratic voice in the process. So by building organizing power, and I mean broad power in the streets through new democratic institutions that perhaps we haven't even imagined yet, in a way that can challenge and topple these titans, that's the way to sort of move forward and actually challenge this sort of system of incompatibility between democracy and capitalism that we see. So in a broad sense, a national sense, or even a global sense, this is obviously a long-term project. I wish I had a campaign plan written up already that will sort of, be able to build. Keisha's like, why don't you have the campaign plan ready yet? That will be able to sort of topple these titans, in the next 6 months. If anyone has that, I would really love to talk to you about it. But on the end of, but it's a long-term project. That doesn't mean that there aren't sort of lots of fights for us to have that get towards the concrete goal of giving the folks who are fighting a further democratic voice and further increased livelihood. One particular example that Acre helped to do some research on, and folks at a couple of our partner organizations have been working on, is workers at Toys R Us. So Toys R Us is now out of business. Toys R Us doesn't exist anymore. They were bought by a private equity firm years ago who basically did what private equity firms do. They raided them for everything and drove them out of business. We see now in sort of the focus on building power with those workers who were then wholesale laid off. And these are workers, one of my colleagues likes to say a lot of the workers that he's working with are like first Bush, like second Bush, like, voted for a Republican over and over again and voted for Trump. And they're in the streets sort of fighting back for, hey, this isn't, the people who are pushing this forward did the wrong thing here. I should have a voice in what happens in, whether, in my livelihood and whether I have a job, fighting for their own democratic voice and fighting for their livelihood. And in many cases, bringing those institutions, those private equity firms to the table, and they're going to win money back for being fired instantly just at, Bain Capital and KKR's whim. Just as an example of what sort of a short-term version of this looks like. And I think that all of those things do start to add up. It both adds up in pushing forward this broad critique of racial capitalism and what we need for a real, true democracy, and I think is going to be the thing that creates real change. Now, the thing that comes out of the other end of that change, I don't think that we could reasonably call it capitalism. I think that those fights are inherently sort of anti-capitalist and very democratic. They're calling for way greater voice and less exploitation. And I don't really think that you could define that as any form of capitalism. So I think I'll leave it there. And yeah, thank you.
So I want just to take a minute to say hello to Bob Master. I just saw that you were here. Bob Master is, oh, the mic.
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to say hello to Bob Master from the Working Families Party and the Communication Workers of America, and also a member of the board of the New Labor and Urban Studies School. So hello, Bob. All right, now, hi. Here's the plan. We're going to take a few minutes for the panelists to, in a sense, bounce back against what the other speakers have said or in favor of what the other speakers have said. But I suggest that what we concentrate on now in this little round is, well, Maurice is probably right. Democratic capitalism is impossible, but we live under capitalism and we have some of the features of a democracy. So in this few minutes round, let's talk about what we should do, okay? And then I'm going to open it to the audience. And when I do, I'm going to plead with you to concentrate on questions for the panelists instead of making this your own forum. There'll be a time when we'll invite you to be the speakers too, but not today, okay? So you want to start us off? Kim, you want to start us off?
With the question of what should we do?
What should we do? Because it's...
Oh my, well, yeah, I think I also don't have a clear, I don't have the strategy plan in my back pocket. I mean, I think that but I do think, I think that I guess I would say two things. One is I think the work that you're doing is extremely important, and the kind of community organizing and labor organizing that many people in this room is engaged in is kind of is the place to begin. And the second place is to be thinking in a serious and critical way about these questions and seeing where that can take us.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, I think one, maybe to not answer a question, but maybe ask another question or make a statement. I mean, I think one, the tech piece that you bring up, Phil, I think is a really interesting piece and is causing this conversation by folks who are not even necessarily our friends about what the future of capitalism should be. I heard one of these people talk about the rise in tech calls for capitalism 2.0, which made me nauseous, the idea of capitalism 2.0. I think we've had enough with the first version. But I do think that's a really interesting thing for us to dig into, like what with really the like devaluing of sort of traditional work that we've done because of, you know, like machines are just able to do it faster. Does that both give an opportunity for us to create something new that doesn't look like our current system of capitalism and perhaps has more democratic voice, but also what are sort of what are the very many probably like risks and challenges and things that the right is going to like use that to claw back with? Yeah, so that's one thing that I think a lot about with this particular question.
Well, I wake up every day charged with thinking about, like, what are we going to do? And in my mind, I think we had social democracy in New York, or the American version of social democracy. That's what all these public institutions meant. Bob Fogelson wrote a book calling LA municipal socialism, talking about something similar in LA. And I think those institutions that we built, CUNY, the public hospitals, public housing, it's all great. But I don't think that's a 100-year-old idea. I don't think that's like the definition of the future. I think we have to strengthen those institutions, not get rid of them. But if we want to improve public health in New York, it's not just about having more H&H hospitals. It really calls for getting the community engaged and preventing sickness and illness. And that has a lot to do with employment, housing, all these other things. But we're paying out the nose because we don't address these things. And we have to create new models for actually how to incentivize and encourage communities to be involved in their own health. When it comes to education, we have now something that falls under me, actually, community schools. We're going to have 250,000 young people in that system. We have 250 of them. And the model is to combine neighborhood organizations and nonprofits and parents, get them involved in the schools literally, and make the schools centers for community activism, of which education is a part. Graduation rates for kids in those schools, and most of those are distressed schools, have doubled. I think we need to build up from that. And I think in general, we need to think about democratizing the private sector, not getting rid of it. Not saying we should substitute a government agency for everything the private sector does, but I think we need to create new forms for worker representation, for community ownership, for voice and consumer bargaining, consumer organizing, et cetera. And through all of our different city programs and state programs, we could be fighting for that. So, for example, this year we trained 4,000 youth through our summer youth jobs program to be organizers. And I'm calling it a democracy corps. Next year, summer, I want to get it to 10,000, 15,000, and then make it year-round, programs in that. And we do that through our city programs. And we integrate that and house that in community schools. And we fund organizations like yours to go out and work with young people. We're going to make the census sign-up campaign an actual wake-up organizing campaign. Not just to fill out a form, but to actually build democracy in New York City. We're going to engage labor unions in doing some of the things I talked about before. And so I think we have an opportunity now to actually create the next thing, to build on what has been here before, but actually to strengthen our democracy, to fight the illusion that the economy operates independent of government and government shouldn't have anything to do. The government's role is to ensure that the private sector is democratic. That was Adam Smith's dream. That was Abraham Lincoln's dream. We can make that real. And that's what I think our vision should be. So believe it or not, the mayor and I are in intense discussions on these issues. And we all want to figure out, where are we going?
So there'll be opportunities for the people here to volunteer, right?
Absolutely.
Actually, I just want to say, I think you make a wonderful point about the importance of not being nostalgic, or that there's I guess in talking about these post-war institutions, both more generally and in New York, and in a way, I think for the labor movement more broadly, that there is a kind of and a desire to kind of look back and say things were better in the past in one way or another. And I think you are right that it's not a question of going back to that or thinking about just kind of breathing life into institutions that have or social arrangements that have existed previously. It is a question of how to think about what looking to the future in a different way. So.
All right, now it's your turn, and we're going to take comments or questions in threes, and then I'll give a chance for the panel a chance to respond. But remember, be crisp, very crisp. Len.
Yeah. I'd like to ask the panel to broaden their perspective, because the question that all three of them addressed was, is democratic capitalism possible in the United States? And I'd like them to deal with, address briefly the question of whether, if you look around the world at what other countries have been able to do, I'm thinking, of course, particularly of Western European and Scandinavian countries, can we learn something from them that will allow capitalism and democracy to coexist in the United States?
Thank you. Yes, I don't know everybody's name. I don't know hardly anybody's name. Yeah.
Hello.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Okay. You mentioned that some of these systems should, not be nostalgic about. But I think what you're leaving out of that equation, and what's always left out with the left, is discussing apartheid. CUNY was free until the doors of apartheid came down and the melanin in the student body changed. My mother went to CUNY, and she said books were free. When I went, I had a heart attack at the age of 19, looking at the price of the textbook. Okay, that's one. Two, too often people talk about technology, but not talking about, if you want a green planet, you better make green technology. Stop having laptops that when you have the second operating system, it has to be thrown away, and there's nothing wrong with it. Nobody's fixing anything anymore. There was work in fixing typewriters. There was work fixing sewing. People don't, if I say sewing machine, they look like I'm from another planet. Okay? And the other thing about apartheid is in candidates. All right? Most black and brown business owners usually work out of the public sector by way of subcontracting and, minority business. There's a whole process with that. We had a executive fatwa from the government saying anybody speaking against Israel will not be hired. Okay? Israel is for practicing apartheid. I don't even have to talk about the Palestinians. The Eritreans were put at gunpoint on a plane after Trump said he's going to evict the illegal aliens from here, and they marched them on a plane and we're going to send them back to their death. We're supporting apartheid with these candidates, and it's turned the clock back. So, which is also feed, as you said, those policies feed, I used to call it disaster capitalism. It is racialized, and I agree. Can we get to that?
Thank you. Yes, you.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Eduardo Rosario. I'm with the New York City chapter of the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement. Wanted to know if the speakers can address the question of black-brown organizing, because it's multifaceted. The intersection of black-brown organizing, goes from criminal reform, criminal justice reform, to immigration rights, immigration reform, to labor rights and protections, to environmental racism, environmental justice, to the North American Free Trade Agreement. Can the panel please share their feelings and thoughts regarding what they've seen have been some of the obstacles to success of black-brown organizing, and what can we do to move forward to be more successful in this arena of organizing? Thank you.
Thank you. A quick round from the panel. Not everybody has to speak, but we'll begin with you, Phil. We began with Kim last time.
So on the question of Denmark and Scandinavia, I don't think we have a lot to learn from Denmark and Scandinavia. And one of the problems I had with Bernie Sanders was, like he said, the U.S. ought to be more like Denmark. We are not Denmark. Denmark is not diverse even for Scandinavia. It's 94% Danish. You know, the politics of America are founded on the kinds of issues the speaker who just spoke, the Latino brother, it's on that kind of issue. That's how our capitalism operates. It's not like Denmark. The issue of how to organize a factory to make something is not the critical issue. Is not the critical issue. Technology has solved how we make stuff. The question is ownership, distribution, and politics at the center of that. Why don't workers identify as workers in the US? When a kid gets married, you don't hear a white guy say, damn it, I hope my daughter marries somebody from the working class and not somebody who's a shop owner, petty bourgeois. You know, damn it, that's what I care about. No, we don't have that kind of consciousness here. It's like, well, damn it, I hope they don't marry a goddamn nigger. That's the kind of consciousness we have here. And so that's our politics. That's the issue. You know, 100 years ago, before tractors, before computers, there were real issues of, can we manufacture enough stuff so people don't starve? Can we manufacture enough stuff so people are warm in the wintertime, et cetera, et cetera? Those aren't the issues today. As far as apartheid goes, same issue. I'm with you. I'm with you, but it's the same issue. I really feel some of the cutting issues we have to address right now are, how do the building trades become racially integrated? How do we get how do we get Dominicans not to say Haitians have nothing to do with them? We won't say anything about the DR and what's going on in their treatment of Haiti. You know, how do we get real struggle around Puerto Rico and make that central to like labor's mission? How do we build black-brown unity in New York City and Asian unity? How are we addressing the specialized school controversies with Asian workers and Asian communities? Because if we can't unite these folks, we will not get to the white worker in Alabama. We will not get there. And so I think those are the central questions. They don't arise in Denmark. They don't arise in Sweden.
So I think the question of sort of the global context can be taken as sort of what does it look like in another country, but I think the other thing that financialization forces us to do is think about capitalism just not being basically unable to be contained. So, you know, because we've shifted away from manufacturing, it's not like there's, you know, an ounce of steel made in the US and is used in the US or something like that. It's more this financial entity moving money around the world from his computer instantly. I think that is a global question. I think basically everything I think that all of the critiques that we made, I think, are critiques of a global system, not a system that's contained in the U.S. Really, U.S. globalized racial capitalism rules the day around the world, whether or not the individual nations, any other individual nation identifies as capitalist or even identifies as democratic or not, I would say would be my response to that. And on the black and brown organizing question, as someone who's done that direct organizing, and anyone else who's done that direct organizing knows that it's very difficult. Part of why it's difficult is, you know, we like to, especially on panels, just say black and brown get together or black and brown organizing as if there's just this like, because I'm black and because you're brown, we have all of the same issues and all of the same experiences and all of the same everything. And there are really similar, obviously, attacks and similar experiences, but they are different both historically and just in the day-to-day. One of the things that we do at Acre through political education is really trace back sort of the line of sort of oppression under capitalism for black folks and for Latinx folks. And they're different sources. The like experiences come from really different sources. It's important to really realize that and to understand that in order to be able to get into really deeper black and brown organizing. I think the answer to the question, though, is like more organizing. Like we need like actually more people doing it. When it happens, it's actually really, really successful. But it takes resources put into actually like organizing folks one-on-one, like two-on-one, whatever, that we haven't really been great at putting resources into historically, and certainly aren't right now.
Yeah, I guess I would just say briefly on the Scandinavia and, well, I mean, how these questions played out around the world, obviously goes well beyond the Scandinavian countries, but those countries too, and the Western European countries and their welfare states have also been under pressure in similar ways as the more limited institutions in the U.S. And so I think in a way they pose the question even more forcefully, how long can these kinds of institutions endure in a global capitalist economy? What are what possibilities they have? What limits do they run into? And then I guess on the question both about apartheid and about black and brown organizing, there was an op-ed by Bhaskar Sunkara, the editor of the Jacobin, in The Guardian a week or two ago, just about the labor movement and unions as the role that they play in addressing racial and gender inequality, and still can play in those ways. And obviously, the history of the movement is flawed on these counts and innumerable different grounds, and yet, nonetheless, despite the flaws and despite the ugly parts of that history, unions have been able to achieve greater equality than most other institutions and efforts. And so it is not, I think, just to, as a reminder and a reminder of the role that the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies can play. It's not just labor, but it is unions that are also devoted to fighting racial inequality and sexual inequality. And that's not automatic, but the capacity of unions to do that is it play a unique role in our society and still can. So just as a testament to the importance of your work too.
Another round of 3. I'm going to point because I don't know names. Yes, you. You don't look as though you're loud. You, the green hat, the green.
We're going to go to Francis. We need the mic for the audio.
So the question I had to do more with, as we're looking at organizing around the country, one of the questions that actually has been coming up a bit more, which has been actually surprising to me as we've been looking in community and we've been asking people what do they need to help organize people. And one of the challenges has actually come up around illiteracy. Illiteracy. And increasingly, we're seeing organizers, candidates, and campaigns saying things like 50%, 40%, 30% of our districts and constituencies can't read. And we're hearing this in places like Tennessee, Michigan, West Virginia, and Texas. And this is not questions of not speaking English or not like this is people who can't read. And this is actually becoming more and more and more of an issue. And I'm really interested in thinking about like how do these basic questions of engagement actually play into these questions, because these issues that you're talking about are really complex and really complicated. And we talk about these things in ways that everyone can deal with this, everyone can engage on these questions. And I'm not persuaded entirely that we're all on the same page as we're trying to engage really large swaths of people that are engaged around these issues.
Green hat.
My name is Robel Teklep. I work at the Public Engagement Unit. Good to see you. I have a few questions from, I think I should say, at the national level and in many ways at even international level. I wanted to see what you may have, you may think about two particular things that are attached to labor. That is universal basic income that has been discussed widely, and the other is the possibility of automated robot communism that comes in jokes, but I think it's a serious possibility. In more concentrated U.S. questions, I have, a few years ago there was an article I read about how blue states are Sweden and red states are Guatemala. That was an article in the New Republic. And I wanted to ask y'all, is that really the case? Do we have Sweden or Denmark, to make it even better, in blue states? Is there a democratic socialist trend that is meaningful in blue states? And the last one, in a more concentrated way to you, Deputy Mayor, is we've been doing Democracy NYC. And I'm asking myself, I work on it, I volunteer for it, why in the hell are we not talking about automatic voter registration? Why are we wasting time on that instead of pushing the state to pass automatic voter registration that every good progressive state in America has passed? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's begin this round with Maurice, if you want.
Sure.
If you need to comment, that is.
Yeah. So on your question, Keisha, around illiteracy, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. So yeah, on your question, Keisha, about illiteracy, I think that we have to, when we think about ways in which sort of democratic rights or democratic voice has been systematically stripped from certain sets of people, and what the mechanisms are to do that, I think that brings up sort of the defunding of public education and other public resources that have led to, amazingly, a spike in illiteracy around the country, concentrated in really particular places. I don't think that it's like tinfoil hat conspiracy theory to think that is an intentional piece of the process, is to sort of have, just like illiterate meat robots, people who can't read, can't engage in a democratic process in the way that other folks can, who are more easily controlled. Not always definitely controlled, but more easily controlled. There's lots of opportunities for us to fight back there. And that is a real problem. That does pose a real problem and is a real call to truly refund public education in a significant way, and in a new way, like through community schools and other ways. But I think that is a real problem. On the demographic trend, I can't remember who asked, on the sort of changing demographic trend side, I actually worry that we put a little bit too much stake in the fact that they're more people of color coming in, and eventually it will all be fine. I kind of don't buy that. I think that both those folks who are coming in, we're not the only people who are fighting for the new people who are coming in, and our side has done a really bad job of fighting for new people in the past 40, 50 years. We've actually lost tremendously in that war. And also, I think it does bring up a new question of democracy. If these people are coming into, do we then have particular states that are majority people of color that have sort of proportionally less power through federal electoral college or other things like that than states that are much wider. That, yeah, I think that it I don't want to put all of our eggs in the like brown people coming in will save us. Like I think we have a lot more work to do than that. Then on the on the question of sort of like are blue states Sweden, I didn't read that article. I'm not totally sure what the thesis of it was, but I do think that we also do this like everything in California and New York and Massachusetts is great, and it's really just like Mississippi and Texas. Like that is, as someone who organized for years in California, like I really think we do a disservice to like what's happening in the entire country when we just kind of wax poetic about how amazing it is in like deep blue states. There is extreme poverty in all of the blue states in the country. There's extreme racism in all the blue states in the country. There are like capitalist titans destroying communities rapidly, like in all of those states. So I think that, yeah, we shouldn't sort of create this sort of sectarian divide between like our states and pretend that we have some that are just like kind of humming along and everything's great, and if we could just export California's model out, then we would be awesome. Like California's got some real issues. Yeah.
Kim, do you want to?
I'll just very briefly, I agree with all that Maurice just said, and I think that but just on the technology question, I think we're actually I think sometimes people on the left can kind of jump into a world of fantasy about these issues, and that actually it is the expansion of artificial intelligence and robots has not, it hasn't had the effect on actual employment levels that people have long kind of fantasized and predicted that it would or imagined that it would. And I just think it is important I think we're quite far from a world, for better or worse, in which robots are doing all the work and there are no more jobs. And I think this actually goes along a bit with the universal basic income. And I think that while there are aspects of that idea which are appealing, I also think there is something about it which is, it's often advanced as a kind of an idea where it's going, the universal basic income, people, some of the technology titans who talk about this are doing so with a sense that this is going to kind of stave off revolt in different ways. I mean, it kind of brings back Fran's work. And I think there too, there's an element of kind of both fantasy and condescension in the idea. So I think it's just to kind of have a certain skepticism about both of those projects and claims.
Well, I sat 18 years at MIT, and I've seen prototypes of what's coming. And I was working with Ford Motor Company and the UAW and their new production model that they are investing heavily in, and it's completely different than the old one. And already we see huge bifurcation in what workers make who have technological skills and what workers make who are like doing what robots tell them to do, or what computers tell them to do. I mean, like $50,000 a year differences in what workers make. And that's going to become bigger. And I really think labor needs to be on top of that. I'm not here predicting inevitability in anything, but I see tremendous investment. The hottest real estate in the entire United States is around MIT right now. And they are because they are creating a whole new way of delivering pharmaceutical medicines that will be to your DNA. And you will walk to a pharmacist and they will custom design your computational biologist pharmacist will custom design a drug for your DNA. And they are like gonna change that industry. Auto's gonna change, you just see it. So I think we gotta be on top of it. Not to take anything for granted, but be on top of it. Literacy. Literacy at the grassroots level, but literacy at every level. Wall Street mainly plays with union pension funds. When I taught at Columbia Business School, the business professors that don't have a labor bone in their body called labor capital dumb capital. That's literally what they train their students. They say labor capital is dumb capital because unions don't pay attention to where their money goes. And all they look for is a return. They don't dig any deeper. That's what they say. And I don't want to offend anybody, but if we're going to talk about illiteracy, we all have to be a lot more literate about how we exercise our own power with our own dollars. And that's at the community level, but that's at every level. You know, if we're going to fight this beast. The other thing I wanted to say about that is Goldman Sachs doesn't have an army last time I checked. It's true that there is such a thing as global finance and this and that, but they don't have an army. You know, the power still is with our political institutions that govern the army. And so what we need to focus on, in my opinion, to fight globalism and to have a voice in it is to gain control of our own politics. Why don't we have same-day voter registration? Because the state legislature and governor have blocked it. That's why. So yesterday, 6 of the 8 IDC Democrats got defeated. This ought to be on the agenda. Same-day voter registration. Labor ought to fight for that. Communities ought to fight for that. That's how we begin to gain power. You know, last, on race and identity. Nothing inevitable about that. The way we will build a unified America, a unified working class, is in the course of struggle. And I agree, nothing forever about how people identify themselves. And I agree, it's not simplistic. I've been working in Colombia, South America in the last 6 years. Yesterday, I met with the leader of like Black Colombian movements, big guy, Luis Murillo, and he brought me a plaque because last year, the Black Colombians in Colombia demanded that the government put the picture of the Black president of Colombia elected in 1861 in the National Palace. Because in the National Palace of Colombia, the government has refused until now to even hang up his picture because he was Black. And when they hung it up, they repainted his face so he looked whiter. And so they had a whole movement to say, you know what? We've had a Black president. Colombia itself is a multiracial country, and we're going to change that. And I only point to that to say how complex these issues are, to your point. We got a lot of Dominicans in New York. We got a lot of Haitians in New York, et cetera. It's nothing simple, but the way we overcome this is by uniting people in the course of struggle. Last month, my staff took care of 300 kids in New York who had been separated by their parents at the border. It was an emotionally transformative movement for all of us, for our whole staff. It brought us together because it said, what are we really about? Who are we? What does being an American, being a New Yorker mean to us? It brought us together, and we all said, the staff, our Immigration Affairs Commissioner cried during the city council hearing, cried. She said, no, we got to stand for something as who we are. That's how we forge new identities. You know, it's not just through some kind of abstract anything, it's through how we wage our struggle.
I think that our time has come to a close. We will reconvene at the next forum, and it'll be very good to see you. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank the staff of the new School of Labor and Urban Studies, and I especially want to thank our great speakers. Let's have another round for the speakers.